time for Southeast Asia. So we just talked about South Asia, where we talked about India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, Nepal, and Bhutan, and some others. We talked about East Asia, where we talked about China. And we talked about North and South Korea, Japan, and Mongolia, and others as well. And now it's time to talk about Southeast Asia and what that means as well. And so just going to get started because we've done this before, believe it or not. We're entering into our last section, actually, where we talk about section 5, where we talk about Southeast Asia, the South Pacific with Australia and New Zealand and the South Pacific Islands, and we talk about Southeast Asia as a region. So little map, a geopolitical map, where we're going to be talking about 11 countries during this section of our last section. Talk about Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Singapore, Indonesia, and East Timor. And so that is 11, and we'll talk about what makes this a region. Largely it's going to be a little bit of cultural, but a little bit of geographic as well. Geographic in terms of physical geography when we talk about the regions as well. But without further ado, like I said, we're going to get started because at this point, we should see the light at the end of the tunnel. We should be professionals about how these videos work. And we're going to get through this one with physical geography up first. So landforms. Indochina Peninsula is going to be quite important. It's actually going to be one of the two ways we characterize this region in terms of its physical geography. So you got the Indochina Peninsula, and then we have islands. Islands, all caps, exclamation point. So let's table that for a second, and let's talk about archipelagos. So it's groups or often chains of islands, so we can imagine. We've got a lot of those coming up, and we're going to talk about that. And then we have 3 main rivers in this section. A lot more, obviously, than 3. We're going to talk about 3 that matter more than the others, if you will, or at least according to the book. Actually, there's kind of 4. We have the Salween, the Irrawaddy, and the Mekong rivers, and then we talk a little bit about the Red River in northern Vietnam. And so there we go. We have the rivers, the Salween, Irrawaddy, Mekong. Remember those, the Red River as well. Archipelago is just a vocabulary term, just to sort of know these groups of chains of islands, because we have countries that are archipelagos in a sense. Then we have islands in Indochina Peninsula. So let's just get right into this image and check it out. And here we go. So we got a lot of islands. We're looking around and saying, this is Southeast Asia. This is our entire chapter here. And here we go. This is the Indochina Peninsula characterized by, surrounded by water on 3 sides, here, here, and here. So we have the Indochina Peninsula. On that peninsula, we have another peninsula, so don't get confused. Oh boy. We have the Malay Peninsula that is part of Malaysia, as split here by this channel. So we have Indochina Peninsula, and then islands. Archipelagos, again, if you say a chain of islands or a group of islands. So the Philippines, about 7,000 islands, a lot. If you think that's a lot, just wait about this. Indonesia, 17,000 islands. And so that's a lot of islands. And so for this region in general, we got, because those aren't the only ones, the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, we have islands off of all the coasts here. And so it's an area that really characterized by islands and largely peninsulas as well. But let's talk about the physical geography just a bit more. So we have a highland area, the Tibetan Plateau, perhaps you've heard of it. If you've been with us, you should have, because we talked about it in South Asia and East Asia. Talked about north of India and southwest China. We have the Tibetan Plateau, where the Indian subcontinent slammed up into the Eurasian plate, the Eurasian continent. Some 60 million years ago produced Tibetan Plateau here in the Himalaya Mountains. We're not seeing that kind of elevation here largely in our region, but we are going to see some mountainous regions up to the north in Southeast Asia, and some mountains throughout the island chains, largely because of volcanic activity. And so we see here the Red River, northern Vietnam, as I said, the Irrawaddy through here, and lastly the Mekong. Well, there's Salween, but we're not going to talk about that anymore. I guess not. It's not on this map, but we'll talk about it later. I always say we'll talk about some things later. Sometimes we never do, but interesting. So the Mekong River coming down through here, and then coming out down here into this body of water. And so what we see here is originating up here in this highland area, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. So recap physical geography. It's going to be dominated by some mountainous areas, some gorges and whatnot. Up here in northern Southeast Asia on the Indochina Peninsula. We have this Indochina Peninsula with some low-lying areas, obviously near the coast, and we have lots of islands to be talking about. Seen here, physical geography characterized with some pictures, both the physical geography in terms of landforms and vegetation, climate and vegetation. People said they like the pictures. I like the pictures too. We have a pretty cool one here. Going through this river system, we see some terraced land used for agriculture, so that's pretty cool. And largely what we see here is we see a lot of green, see a lot of water, and that's in the most simplest of terms. We can't get really any simpler than looking at something like that. But what that largely comes down to is, let's just say again, it's not hard to imagine that these pictures are derived from this image here, and because again, this area largely characterized by its relationship with the ocean and rivers, the oceans and rivers, and largely some of its mountainous areas as well. So I think I've said enough on that physical geography to this point for our purposes and for what the book says. And we next talk about climate. A few types of climates here to know. So we've talked about AF before, hot and wet AF. Now to know, AF is tropical rainforest, and dark blue, it's largely all of Indonesia essentially. Find a little pocket here and say, haha, I spotted an air or something. No, largely all of Indonesia's tropical rainforest, and then we go and talk about some of these other tropical ones where we talk about largely tropical monsoons. So we have tropical rainforests, tropical monsoons, and a little bit of humid subtropical up here in the northernmost areas. And that's going to be quite important when we talk about vegetation types, which we're going to just talk about a little bit of the vegetation coming forward on the next slide. And especially when we talk about also rainfall, which is going to be up next. This clicker is a little overzealous. So precipitation, we talked about rain a lot before. If you remember, Darjeeling, India, the wettest place in the world, they only get rainfall about half the year. So it's kind of impressive that it's the wettest place on earth, only gets rain about half the year. And why does that happen, if you remember, was because of the wet and dry monsoon periods. And so just like South Asia and Southeast East Asia, I've probably just lost you, and that's all right, just raise up the white flags. But in all seriousness, come back to me. We had South Asia, where we talked about monsoons and things in that area where would be affected by wind patterns like the Intertropical Convergence Zone or the ITCZ. And now picture this, we have East Asia as a region and Southeast East Asia. So we're talking about southern China, Taiwan, in this area. Again, we had, that humid subtropical wet area. So now that you're back, we're going to talk about monsoons and the Intertropical Convergence Zone characterized here. So we have the monsoon period that drops a lot of rain on this region, and when that isn't happening, we have the Intertropical Convergence Zone, as we know, is characterized by wind patterns that drop a lot more rainfall on the region. So this area typically always quite wet, one of the wettest regions on Earth, which is why we have tropical rainforests. Not too hard to connect all the dots there. However, impact of El Nino. We talked about El Nino before, El Nino and La Nina, and we talked about it in Middle and South America. We talked about other places because the impact of El Nino and La Nina can be felt around the world. And we're going to talk about it just briefly here because every 2 to 7 years, this region feels the effects or the impacts of El Nino in the sense that this relationship between the monsoons and the Intertropical Convergence Zone and El Nino create a period of cool, dry weather, okay? And so that produces droughts, no kidding. And so when this happens, every 2 to 7 years, somewhat of a pattern, but it kind of varies because it's kind of a 5-year give or take, we have these periods of cool, dry land, and then we have periods of less rain, and then we have droughts. And that can be obviously a problem. Now, we talk about detritus and forest. So what am I talking about here? Well, we just want to talk about forest cover. This is a vocabulary term. It's why it's in bold. We're going to talk about the organic decay of plant matter and such, and how this has an effect on the forest and the biodiversity and the ecology of the forests themselves. And as we're seeing here, we have Borneo, Indonesia. It's an island, if you remember. It's one of the largest islands of the, in terms of world's islands, it's actually on the list, of course. It's on the list somewhere. But, it's a relatively larger island. But large island in the Indonesian archipelago of the Indonesian islands, the country of Indonesia, is quite important because it shares Indonesia and Malaysia and Brunei, three different countries having a claim on that island of Borneo. But we talk about forest cover, and forest cover largely more impressive at this point on the islands than it is on the mainland, largely due to human-environment interactions. And so that's going to be somewhat important when we talk about climate and vegetation going forward. That brings us to the environment. Video link, check it out, probably something cool there. But here we go, climate change and deforestation. We talked about, to the environment now. We talked about deforestation before. It's a negative topic because nobody likes when we cut down all the trees and we release a bunch of greenhouse gases, and the animals have no longer a place to call home, and then we just add our impact on climate change. It's quite sad. This is the second worst area for deforestation in the entire world in terms of a region. We have sub-Saharan Africa, and then we have Southeast Asia. A little fact here, since 1950, so about 68 years at this point, 60% of the tropical forest cover on the island of Borneo has been gone. So we just talked about Borneo in that picture. Seen here is an orangutan from the island of Borneo. And so in 68 years, about 60% of that tropical forest cover gone, largely for these endeavors that we're going to be talking about just soon. So loss of habitat for endangered species. The island of Sumatra, we have Sumatran rhinoceros, we have Sumatran tiger, we have orangutans, we have amphibians, and a whole host of endangered species that are at risk of losing their habitat and becoming more and more endangered to the point of the brink of extinction. So that's not good. And so the book talks about climate change and deforestation and the relationship, and deforestation giving way to new economic endeavors for the people of Southeast Asia, largely here palm oil production and its loss of the forest. But this slash and burn agriculture or shifting agriculture that we're going to talk about on the next slide gives way to palm oil production. In the book, if you read it, palm oil production is like in everything. It's cooking and it could be used for fuel source and a whole host of cosmetics and all kinds of other products. The palm oil is something that is an important economic resource for the people of some of these different countries. Indonesia and Malaysia are 1 and 2 for biggest producers of palm oil production in the entire world. I've seen palm oil plantation in Costa Rica. It's taking place all over the world, so I've been told. Haven't seen it taking place all over the world, but then again, negative endeavor when it comes to preserving the ecological integrity of the biodiversity of natural habitat. That being said, it has become a major industry in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. So here we go, climate change and food production. Slash and burn agriculture, we know, so forest that's there, they come in, the people here, they slash it, chop it, what have you, destroy the forest, and they burn it, which is emitting obviously terrible emissions, contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, especially when you're doing it by hundreds of thousands of acres at a time. So slash and burn agriculture is a practice in Southeast Asia, as well as shifting agriculture. And I talk about shifting agriculture in the sense where we have a plot of land farmed by a man or a woman, and after a period of time, they move on to another plot and keep moving, and then they rotate back, and after a period of some years, they come back to that original plot and do it all over again. And that's largely because the soil is fertile, but not as fertile as it could be, as we see in other parts of the world. And so to preserve the integrity of the soil for positive yields and things like that, they move and they shift, which is something like the idea of crop rotation. When you have a plot of land and you farm tomatoes on it, and then the next year you farm beans, and then the next year something else, and that's largely to rejuvenate the soil through a variety of minerals and deposits that would be taking place without simply ruining the soil by one particular type of crop without any other type of ecological diversity. So that's taking place, slash and burn agriculture and shifting agriculture taking place in Southeast Asia. Now next, paddy rice production and methane. So paddy rice, aka wet rice production, so it's the same thing, so not both. But paddy rice production and wet rice production, very important for its dietary contributions. So people here rely on rice for it's a staple of their diet, but also as a main point of agriculture in terms of the economy, this wet rice production. So 1/3%, when we talk about methane now, what do I mean? Paddy rice production and methane. I don't see a connection unless you read the book and you're listening to me. So 1/3% of the world's methane that's released in terms of an emission comes from the flooding of paddy rice production or wet rice production. And so these fields largely water intensive. You'll see some pictures of them. I think we had one. We'll have some definitely coming up later. A largely water intensive endeavor. We talked about that in South and East Asia. So wet rice production, water intensive because of the nature of this plant. And so when it floods, methane is emitted into the atmosphere. And so 1/3% of the world's methane released comes from wet rice production. Obviously not good. Also not good because in the last 25 years, paddy rice production has increased 17%. So due to population boom and demand. And so this phenomenon is obviously only getting worse. And so this same story here, small scale farming has become rare, large cash crop operations now exist. And so that being said, we have these push and pull factors that are driving people out of rural areas and into urban areas. So they're giving up small scale subsistence farming and giving that up for large cash crop operations, tropical fruits, coffee, chocolate, palm oil, and the same sort of story that's taking place around the world, largely due to that green revolution that we've seen and heard about before. So next, climate change and water, and I sort of ill-named this category. It's this slide is too broad, water, but we'll break it down. So old news, glacial melting. So if you remember back, let's think all the way back to just a few slides ago. Perhaps you can remember back 4 or 5 minutes at this point and think about glacial melting. Think about actually what we talked about in South and East Asia with glacial melting. A lot of these rivers seeing their origins in the Tibetan plateau, in these highlands, and these rivers originate there. And that's the same thing as we see with the Mekong River, and this one is going to be our feature river for this section. So the Mekong River, its origins are also in the Tibetan highland, Tibetan plateau, Himalayan highland, this mountainous area, as just a small byproduct of some glacial melting and a small mountainous stream that turns into the mighty Mekong River. And it being up there, it certainly relies on the same practices of the environment that have taken place without the negative impacts of the humans on the environment. So what takes place when we talk about glacial melting as a concern? Well, first comes flooding, next comes no water. And so glacial melting is a result of unsustainable melting of the ice and the glacial melting that's taking place there. So at first, it's producing large amounts of water that can lead to flooding, it can lead to land and mudslides, and can crop loss. It's actually quite negative, but that's just in the interim. And largely we believe that at a certain point, when it no longer becomes sustainable of the ice melting, that there's only a finite amount, that then the water systems dry up altogether. So either way, glacial melting in this case, beyond the norm, certainly a negative characteristic for the Mekong River as well as other major rivers around the world. Next, coral bleaching. And so this is a vocabulary term that you might want to jot down. I'm not going to read it out loud for you. But again, coral bleaching, it's taking place here as depicted in this picture. Negative ecological impacts of climate change, ocean acidification, and coral bleaching. Sea temperatures rising over the last so many years, and so has a negative impact obviously on our corals, but not just to say that, oh, that's not aesthetically pleasing because we've lost some color, but just this idea of how negative of an impact this is on the biodiversity and the ecology of these systems is quite profound. It has an impact not only when we talk about now humans, I'm not going to go diving or snorkeling to take a look at this. So some people and some countries have cited a loss in tourism revenues as a result, in the fishing industry, because some fish that rely on this system for their natural reproduction, as well as just simply this is really unfortunate and unexcusable for humans to have done this to the world. But I digress. So lastly, and kind of removed from this general theme of climate change and water, is just something that was also in the book that's worth noting, is increase in frequency and strength of tropical storms in the region in Southeast Asia. We talk about that earthquake and tsunami, so not a tropical storm, but talk about an earthquake that gave way to a tsunami in 2004, which killed 230,000 people, one of the worst natural disasters in recorded human history. Takes place there in 2004. So we know this area, and we talk about obviously increase in storms, typhoons, and tsunamis, which are tidal waves. Typhoons are like our hurricanes. But we also talk about volcanic activity because we're in the Ring of Fire in the Pacific coast. So again, all of these sort of things as a result of just natural disasters, and then some things dealing with climate change more broadly. So responses to climate change, the Mekong River. And the book talks about this Mekong River seen here. So the biodiversity of the Mekong River is quite impressive, behind only the Congo River and the Amazon River. Now I know you've heard of both of these because you're listening to this video, and if you've listened to this video, chances are you've listened to some others, or watched as well. And so biodiversity of the Mekong River, situated third in the world for most biodiversity. The Congo River Basin and Congo River in central sub-Saharan Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or Congo-Kinshasa, and we talk about the Amazon River in South America. So the Mekong River, again, its origins high in the highlands of the Tibetan Himalayan region, the highland area, the mountainous areas of northern Southeast Asia, flowing down through a variety of countries on the Indochina Peninsula and out into the sea. So the importance of the biodiversity of the Mekong River cannot be understated when we have some freshwater dolphins and some amphibians and some all kind of other cool species that the book talks a little bit about, maybe only a sentence about, but if you're like me, gravitate to that sentence because it's pretty cool. It's a giant catfish and all kind of other things. But nevertheless, because of China, largely China being so close in proximity and its geopolitical influence in the region, because it's quite large and got a lot of money, it's got a lot of power, is hydroelectric dams. So we know China has had a field day with hydroelectric dams. We talked about the Three Gorges Dam and its negative impact for a variety of reasons. It's flooding and displacement of people, its cause of disease, it's got some cracks in it, it's kind of like a failure in terms of even just building the darn thing. So anyways, Three Gorges Dam in China. But this, again, hydroelectric dams on the Mekong River, proposal for more and more hydroelectric power in terms of dams in the Mekong River. This can be a geopolitical debate because this river is shared among many nations, but also the consequences of a dam, like I just gave the example of the Three Gorges Dam in China. Again, we have geopolitical debate, we have an ecological crisis because we'll be, unfortunately, again, tampering with the river system. Dams, again, control flooding. Rivers need to flood for the, to preserve and support certain species that are in that river system. So it might be a burden on humans, but it's certainly, especially for those that settled right along here, but not really a burden for the natural landscape. Nevertheless, hydroelectric dams, in a pursuit for, getting off of fossil fuels, it is a proposal for a more renewable way of getting power or electricity. In that same theme, but not related to the Mekong River, the book talks about geothermal power potential in Indonesia and the Philippines. Specifically those two, you have to be close to volcanic activity. You don't have to be close to volcanic activity, but it really helps if you are. And right now, Philippines already has 27% of its power from geothermal, and so there's great potential in the Philippines and Indonesia for that. Hydroelectric power potential for the areas in the Mekong River system, as we saw in China. So that actually wraps us up with part 1 already of the Southeast Asia. We're going to be coming up on part 2 in subregions, and that's going to be a wrap for the first half of our last section, and next one coming up next.